my colleague Daisy. Thank you. We are recording. Along with my colleague Daisy Diaz-Strong, who is an assistant professor of social work at the University of Illinois Chicago. So she's handling all the technical aspects of today's event, which I am grateful for. Um, so a couple of quick housekeeping points before we get started. First, please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. You're welcome to have camera on or off, whatever you prefer, but please do stay muted. And we will have some time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So feel free to put questions or comments in the chat at any point. Daisy and I will kind of monitor that. If there's anything sort of time sensitive, we can break in with our presenters. Otherwise, we'll hold those to the end after they have completed the presentation of their research. And we are recording this, and that video will get shared through the SSEA website probably in a few days. So I think we'll be able to let people know in case you want to like share the recording with a colleague if you think anyone else would be interested in this. Okay, so we are delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues from SUNY New Paltz, Associate Professors Tabitha Holmes and Matthew Weiss. So both of them are developmental psychologists. Dr. Holmes's current research focuses on how emerging adults are influenced by the stories they construct and consume. And Dr. Weiss's work examines cultural influences on social cognition and moral development. But today they're going to share some findings from a really fascinating collaboration that they've been working on together over the past year or so, I think, more than that. Basically examining college students' perceptions on the very hot topic of academic integrity, including perceptions about the use of AI. So I don't think I need to elaborate on how important this topic is for anyone particularly involved in education. So I'm just going to turn it right over to them to discuss their work titled Cheating is Not Okay, but It's Not Always Wrong, How Students Make Sense of Academic Honesty. So welcome,
Great.
Matt and Tabitha.
Thank you so much, Carla.
Thank you,
Uh,
Carl.
yeah, so I wanted to just share how we came to do this work. I was right on the brink of sabbatical, and I was having a semester of extreme frustration with the amount of cheating that I was seeing in my class. And so I walked into a cultural seminar and I put up on the board, we're actually talking about morality. And so I put up on the board a question, a very poor question, I will admit, a leading question of, is it always wrong to cheat? And I don't know what I expected. I just thought this is a good way to kind of introduce morality and get students thinking about their own choices. And I was kind of blown away by the conversation because everyone in the room, to a student, said that they felt that there were times when cheating was appropriate and was not necessarily wrong. Definitely not morally wrong, but not wrong at all. And so they started opening up, and we had a really candid conversation about times when they think cheating is maybe not optimal, but not necessarily a bad thing. And so I immediately went and talked to my colleague Matt, who studies moral development and is very interested in issues around morality. And I said, this is fascinating. I think we need to like figure something. I think we need to look at this issue. And so he was very eager to do so as well, coming from his perspective of looking at culture and morality. And so that was really the impetus for what we're going to talk about today. So Matt's going to start out talking about, yeah, so I'll just turn it over to Matt, and then we're going to kind of toggle back and forth. Matt did a quantitative study, and then so we're going to start out with that in the beginning, and then we'll go into some of the qualitative findings that I focused on.
Yes, yeah. So this is, I think clearly a topic of interest to many, particularly those in higher education. These strikingly high rates, and as Tabitha had mentioned, the brazen way in which students are discussing it really just pose a serious daunting challenge to us in higher education, right? So looking at the numbers, right, some data suggests that more than 60% of college students have engaged in some type of cheating at some point. These rates are even higher actually among high school students, according to researchers at the International Center for Academic Integrity, right, as high as 95%, which from a developmental standpoint is kind of interesting, that change in age-related cheating behavior. And of course, when we're talking about academic dishonesty, there are so many different types. So kind of looking at more specific types, right, and more recent data from the International Center for Academic Integrity, it shows that in terms of cheating on a test or exam, 32% of undergraduates have done so, and almost a quarter have used unauthorized electronic resources. And speaking of the unauthorized electronic resources, this brings up the issue of AI related academic cheating. And this is something that adds very much a layer of complexity to the situation, given that we're all figuring out how to navigate this, right? There's striking variability in terms of what types of AI use is permitted or not permitted, or maybe even encouraged. So of course, everyone is making sense of this, as well as difficulty detecting it when it is used, right? So again, just the idea that these rates are high, right? We're seeing increasing use of AI, right? AI is used very frequently, and that's a difficult area to navigate from a moral standpoint. So to zoom out a little bit, in terms of the psychological research on cheating behavior more broadly, not just academic cheating specifically, there is this way in which the influence the situation has been shown to have a particularly strong influence, right? So, for example, this historically, classic study by Hartshorn and May found inconsistency in terms of cheating behavior across situations, right? So rather than having this profile of a cheater who cheats whenever there's an opportunity, it really varies across different types of situations. There's also this strong effect of in-group members, right, or peers, particularly when they're from the same group as us. Research by Gino and colleagues found that when a student, a Confederate in the study, was blatantly cheating in a way that was very obvious to other students, they cheated more when that student was wearing the same T-shirt as their university, right? So they're a member of the same university that was on their T-shirt. In-group member, their cheating increased, right? It didn't increase when they were members of a different university, or that was made salient. So strong effects of the peer group, the so-called bad apple in the peer group. And then also there's a way in which we are sensitive to social norms regarding cheating behavior, right? And some interesting research on this regard was done by Liu and colleagues. And they found that perhaps surprisingly to a lot of people, right, whenever this research gets discussed, many people are surprised by it. They found that studying abroad actually led to more cheating behavior, right? And this was mediated by moral relativism, right? So people are experiencing different types of moral norms and kind of exploiting that wiggle room with regard to what can be considered right. And they ended up having higher rates of cheating.
Okay, so I think it's important for us to, before we kind of unpack how students are thinking about cheating or academic integrity, to think about how today's emerging adults are different than prior generations. And we certainly know that from all of the work that many of us read and engage in. But just a couple of things that I think are relevant to think about in the context of cheating. First, the obvious one, emerging adults are digital natives. They don't know a world or a life without being connected to easy access to information. And that easy access to information has made cheating extraordinarily easy and accessible. So if we think about back in the day when students might have written notes on their wrist, or their on the inside of their leg or something like that, very different than what cheating looks like today. And so I think another thing to think about is that information and sources and where information comes from is not necessarily clear. There's so much in the public domain now. Um, and what it's done, some research suggests, is just watered down how people think about authorship and knowledge creation, and how, how you give people credit for the work that they've done. So I think that coupled with the ease of access to information and not knowing where it's coming from and not knowing how to cite it has made many problems apparent in academia. Emerging adults also are certainly facing uncertain financial futures. And so a lot of them have really shifted to this idea of the ends justify the means. So, in that initial conversation that I had with students, they really talked about the fact that ultimately what they care about are the grades, because the grades allow them to go to graduate school, and and graduate school allows them to get a job. And if they need to cheat along the way, that makes sense because I mean that's okay because it's helping them get to this achievable goal, and to not do so often puts them at a disadvantage. So I think, the uncertain times, the student debt, the idea that jobs are not as easily accessible is really weighing on these students, and so they're focusing more on grades than we have ever seen in the past. And of course part of that is doing well and having good grades themselves. We also see that a lot of students are coming into college that wouldn't necessarily maybe 30, 40 years ago gone to college. They feel it as an expectation. They don't have another choice. They don't have an option. So they're being socialized to this idea that college is a necessity. Now we're starting to see a shift in that in the political conversation, and we'll see what happens with that. But I think, you know, some work has suggested that you are getting a different group of students. So some maybe do not feel that they're competent, they might not feel motivated, and so they're not as invested in the topics that they're studying for the understanding of the topic. They're really seeing it as these are a bunch of hoops I have to jump through, and so their whole perspective on what it takes to be successful has shifted a bit. And then finally, there's this interesting idea, out there that young people today just have much less tolerance for boring or useless activities. They are looking for more meaningful activities, more meaningful work, and they do not particularly appreciate when they don't see a link between an assignment, for example, and the reason or rationale for why they're doing. And so we'll see this come up a little bit in the data that we collected. But it, they're prioritizing meaningful and enjoyable activities. And so students often see cheating as an expedient way to do things that are meaningful. Rather than spend the time that it takes to do work on your own, they see it as a really quick shortcut and an easy way to get to those things that they do think are meaningful. And there's some interesting findings that I'm going to talk about in our work that in terms of how they think about what is meaningful. So I think that's the backdrop for thinking about perhaps why cheating is a different animal today than it was in the past, and how we may need to think about it differently.
So, with all that in mind, right, these situational factors and these the specific historical moment that we're living in, and the way in which there's a strong incentive to cheat in many circumstances, and it's done with more ease. When we talked about the issue and we're talking about the morality of it, right? I was wondering about what specific values might potentially buffer against this, right? What types of moral beliefs might people hold, emerging adults hold, that might, reduce their temptation or the decision to cheat. So in order to do this, we conducted some research examining emerging adult college students' ethical values, as well as their self-reported academic dishonesty. And in thinking about ethical values, this can be a bit of a tricky thing. There are many ways to think about this. So we wanted to utilize an approach that gets at the breadth of different moral values that one can have, one that I think appreciates and takes into consideration diversity in moral values. And so this was the three ethics approach, which breaks values down into three broad categories of autonomy, community, and divinity. And so, for example, the ethic of autonomy is one that prioritizes the individual, right? What rights the individual has, promoting the welfare of the individual. But people are also members of groups and societies, right? So the ethic of community is a distinct ethic that takes as priority one's group membership, right? What duties does one have to the group, right? And then finally, there's also an ethic of divinity, which looks at the spiritual dimensions of people's ethical values and beliefs, right? What kinds of rules or laws or beliefs do you have that are tied to some kind of spiritual or religious beliefs? So we were looking at, again, a sample of emerging adult college students between the ages of 18 to 29, 169 students who we had them in terms of reporting their ethical values. We used the ethical values assessment. And in terms of academic dishonesty, we utilized something called the McCabe International ICAI for short, Academic Misconduct Instrument, which was the most recent validated academic misconduct scale that we could find, as well as an AI-related academic dishonesty measure that was created by our wonderful student collaborators who really worked hard on this. They're currently actually working on validating this, but we utilized that measure as well. So just to talk a little bit more about the measures. So the ethical values assessment, again, is tapping those three ethics that I was talking about earlier. Participants rate the importance of these specific values from not at all important to completely important. So the ethic of autonomy, for that specific ethic, it would be something like I should be fair to other individuals. As an example item, for community, I should be a good member of society. Divinity, I should aim for spiritual salvation, just to give a little bit of the flavor of what these different items look like. And in terms of this measure of academic misconduct, again, the Miami for short, right, was based on work by McCabe, who for decades had worked on academic misconduct. And this particular measure was an updated version. They updated the language and certain items. There was not an AI-related component, which is why we developed that separate measure. But besides that, it really does cover a broad array of different cheating behaviors. It's self-reported frequency of engaging in the behavior from never to more than 11 times. So something like, for example, getting questions or answers from someone who has already taken a test, to things like where you're paying somebody or working together. So really a broad array of different types of academic misconduct tapped. And then again, in terms of making this AI-related academic dishonesty scale, we use a similar response format, actually the same response format of frequency, so self-reported frequency. And in coming up with these items, because there's this challenge that I mentioned earlier about what is considered dishonesty, and it varies so much depending on instructor, depending on the policy of a particular school, it really, the items hinged on doing this without authorization or when it's explicitly prohibited. So something like using AI tools to generate answers or responses for exams or quizzes without authorization. So really, as a thread to kind of tie these together, this idea that you are using AI in a manner that has been prohibited in that particular context. So in terms of expectations, right, how exactly might these values relate to academic dishonesty? We thought that the ethic of autonomy would be particularly important, such that the more these participants, these emerging adults, endorsed an ethic of autonomy, the less they would cheat. The reason for this was that based on past research, in our particular sample, which is emerging adult college students in the US, emerging adults tend to prioritize this ethic, again, in similar samples to ours. And in terms of thinking about why that might actually specifically relate to this, besides just endorsing it more, the fact that one could view academic dishonesty as violating some of these individual level concerns, right? You are being unfair to others, right? Other individuals by taking advantage of a cheating opportunity. You're also, from an individual kind of standpoint, you're not taking responsibility for your own behavior, right? You're cheating because you're not doing what you as an individual are supposed to do. So in terms of what we found, we did not find a relationship between the ethic of autonomy and academic dishonesty. And we did not find a relationship between the ethic of divinity and academic dishonesty. But we did find an interesting relationship between the ethic of community and dishonesty, right? So specifically, students who endorsed more strongly endorsed an ethic of community were less likely or more infrequently engaged in cheating behavior. So it's important to point out this was a statistically significant relationship, but it's still relatively weak, right? So it's not a super strong correlation, but is there. And also the fact that this related to just the general Miami measure, so the general cheating behavior, it didn't relate to AI specifically. And also just in terms of looking more closely at some of the items that seem to be driving this, right? I should take care of my family and I should be a good member of society were some specific items that seem to be particularly influential. Okay. We also ran a multiple regression model with all of the all the ethics in as predictors, right? So autonomy, community, divinity, and similarly, we found a relationship that the ethic of community was predictive significantly. But it's also important to point out as a model, right? It didn't do the best job explaining variability in the cheating behavior, right? So only about 4% of the variance in cheating behavior was explained by the model. So it seems that there is this interesting relationship with the ethic of community, right? Such that maybe having some community-oriented values to a certain degree can is associated with less academic cheating. But again, it's not particularly strong, not associated with AI. I mean, this was preliminary work, a small sample. There's this question of how much this generalizes across cultures. In a lot of our initial conversations, Tabitha and I were very interested in doing this cross-culturally as well, and that desire to do that still remains. And I think it would be interesting to look at across a number of different samples, or more broadly. There's also this way in which we didn't really tap into how students are explaining this behavior exactly. How are they justifying it? How are they making sense of it? Which is why it's so beneficial to have this kind of mixed method approach that we've been talking about, where Tabitha was able to conduct qualitative research getting at how students actually talk about and explain this behavior. So this question is then, if there's not really the strong predictor of values, how are they explaining it, right? How are they making sense of and justifying this behavior? Which is where the qualitative data comes in. So I'll turn things over to Tabitha now.
All right, great. So you can go one forward. Great. So there has been work certainly on plagiarism and looking at different explanations for cheating. For the most part, this work has been quantitative, and it points to a variety of different ways that are models that you could use to understand a young person's behavior in terms of plagiarism. So for example, there is, a lens of deontology where it's really looking at this idea of right or wrong, and it's not based on the consequences. It's just kind of this kind of moral compass of what is right in society or what is wrong in society. So is that something that is important for young people when they're making a decision? Utilitarianism is, of course, much more based on this idea of the cost and benefits. So what is the utility in this particular behavior? And this is specifically aimed at with the idea that you're not necessarily hurting someone. Machiavellianism is a bit darker, and this is where even if it hurts somebody, so even if it changes the curve, or even if it's not fair to others, your own interest is what is at stake and at the heart of decision making. It's benefiting you, and what happens to anybody else doesn't matter. We've also got kind of a rational self-interest, so rationalizing a decision for personal gain, and making sense of that again, that kind of overlap with some of the others that I talked about. Cultural relativism, so the norms of one's group, kind of what is typical. And I think that that's a very interesting question of how normative do young people think that cheating is, and how does that drive or influence their behavior? And then situation or contingent theory. So what are the circumstances? Do students use the circumstances of their life or of the class or of the assignment to make sense of their cheating behavior? So these are all explanations that have been used in the past. This was an inductive qualitative study, so we were not in any way tapping into these specific questions. We wanted to see, did these issues or did these explanations, these ethical theories emerge as part of what students talked about when we asked them open-ended questions about their beliefs? Okay, so this was part of a larger project, and so it was part of the Qualtrics. So we did the quantitative part and then the qualitative. We had a series of open-ended questions about academic dishonesty. And we really encourage students to give as many details as possible and examples. Ideally, this would have been a face-to-face interview, but for variety of ethical concerns with the IRB and some glitches that we had, we decided to do it through Qualtrics initially, and we're still thinking that we might do some interviews for follow-ups. And so we asked a variety of questions with open-ended, basically text boxes for students to respond, and we got very detailed, lengthy responses, which I think was really encouraging. So sample questions were, do you think some ways of cheating are more serious than others? Under what circumstances do you think cheating is okay? Just as some sample questions. So we had 45 participants, mean age of 25. They were all current undergraduate students at SUNY New Paltz, 60% female, 16% male, 11% non-binary, and 11% did not answer. And we had a range of majors. So we really did not just want psychology students. So we wanted to have, folks from across the spectrum. And so we certainly had some diversity. So we had LA&S, we had liberal arts and sciences, we had 14. You can see business. The most common was fine and performing arts, math and engineering, and then a couple of folks didn't answer. So our analysis was based on Braun and Clark's reflective thematic analysis. So we did do, my research team and I, we did do line-by-line identification of salient themes. We then clustered codes into salient codes, and then we clustered them into meaningful themes. Everything was coded at least twice, and inter-rater reliability exceeded 90%. Okay, so what were some of the things that students pointed to? So first of all, the most common response that students gave for the why question, the why do students cheat? They really talked about personal characteristics. So the personal characteristics of themselves or other students. So they talked about the fact that students often cheat because they just don't care. They don't care. They're unmotivated or uninterested by the topic. So why exert a lot of time? What we found with this was that a lot of times students in particular thought that it was fine to cheat on GE classes because they felt that they were not of interest to them. They were forced to take them, and that it wasn't something that was meaningful to them. I'll get into that. So that was so they would talk about the personal characteristics of the cheater, if you will, as being unmotivated. And the reason that they were unmotivated was because of the content of the class. Sometimes they talked about students not understanding the material and kind of, doing everything they could. They didn't have the capability to do well, so that they had no resort. They had to cheat if they wanted to do well. And then this theme of fear of failure came up a lot. So students who are very pressured to do well, and again, they almost feel as if they have no choice. And then many students talked about students as simply lazy. So a couple of the quotes that highlight this, there is so much pressure to be perfect, and the pressure can push people to do unethical things. Again, that kind of fear of failure came up as a very salient theme. And then the second quote, I think the person who is most likely to engage in cheating is completely apathetic toward education. They do not care. To them, classes are not about the material. They're just a stepping stone to a bigger goal. Either they believe it's pointless or the work is not worth their time. So really making these internal attributions for why people cheat. Then about a quarter of them focus on the characteristics of the class. And as a professor, I, of course, found this one very interesting. So the majority of these students actually focused on the professor. So here were some external attributions that we had going on. So specifically, they talked about the fact that it was justified to cheat if the professor was unclear, uninteresting, had a lazy approach, or had unrealistic expectations. So again, just to give you a flavor for that, if a teacher is vague in their directions with homework or is poor at teaching, then I do not view cheating as cheating because the fault lies with the teacher. When I've cheated in the past, it was usually because I had no interest in the class or subject, and the teacher was generally weird or uninteresting. And then part of the characteristics of the class, aside from the professor, were focused on the idea of, again, as I was saying, like that GE rationalization. So it's important, it's irrelevant, the class assignment isn't meaningful, that sort of thing. So, like I said, I don't think it's that serious to cheat in a random low-level class. I don't know if I would say it's okay because I don't want to condone it, but I'd be lying if I said that I have never cheated on anything. So again, there's this kind of interesting way that they talk about it. They're not completely saying it's the best approach, but they're also saying, for the most part, I do it anyway and it's okay. Another big reason for the why had to do with pressure points, what we called pressure points. And this was that students simply described that their lives are very stressful and they get backed up against a wall and they don't know what to do. A lot of this had to do with emotional stress and personal circumstances, or just this idea that they're working 3 jobs, they're taking 5 classes, they have 300 pages to read, and they just simply don't know what to do. So this was a typical response. I cheated on a reading assignment in a class last semester. It was a very busy weekend for me. I was dealing with the loss of a friend. Um, and I had a 12-page reading to read and summarize due Sunday at 11:59. I was overwhelmed and stressed. My teacher didn't accept late work. I asked my dad to read it for me and send me what it was about. I paraphrased it and submitted it. I did feel guilty having my dad read my homework for me, but I was so mentally exhausted that I couldn't do the assignment. Um, so that one's interesting. And we did not have a lot of people say that their parents helped them cheat, but I think again, this idea of just being so tapped out that you will resort to anything, even if it's having your parent summarize an assignment for you. Um, Only about 10% focused on the outcome. So that idea of the rationale being, I just need to get a good grade, that I'm so focused on the grade. About 10% said that. So they talked about this need. It was literally couched in the language of need. I need to get a better grade. I need to pass. And then 8% just simply said, it's easy. It's almost like I would be stupid to not do it. It's right in front of you. And so the rationale was certainly, it was simply just accessibility. Then we wanted to know how they judged the seriousness of the cheating and if they saw, if they differentiated between different kinds of cheating. And so I would say that the big take home in this section was that they're kind of all over the place around perspectives on plagiarism and using AI. And you can see this in the example. So one student says, if you use AI or fully plagiarize an essay, it's disgusting, it's stealing. And then another student says, plagiarism isn't as bad because I don't care about intellectual property. So completely different, completely opposite responses. And then this interesting piece of with the AI. So if you are using somebody else to do your homework, a real life human, that is worse than using AI. AI is not a being that you are taking away from something. AI was created to help us. So perspectives on AI are diverse. Some students see it as a tool. Some students see it as a no-brainer. Why would we not use this as a tool? Some students do really make that link that it's people's work and it's stealing. So really very across the board. So again, I think the take home is that students are still figuring AI out, as are we. And so there isn't a clear consensus on how to think about it. And I think part of that is because, as you'll see in one of the final quotes I share, faculty are dealing with it very differently. So some faculty are integrating it into their class and really viewing it as a tool. And other faculty say if you use it AI at all, it's it's cheating and you're going to fail the class. So they're getting very mixed messages and they don't seem to kind of know what to do with that. Um, Another reason they gave for the seriousness of the cheating was the characteristics of the assignment. So again, this kind of idea of they're kind of weighing the pros and cons of what the assignment is. It meaningful? Does it weigh a lot? So they felt that if an assignment had a lot of weight, that was worse than if you were doing kind of a one-off and it was it was cheating or it was homework as opposed to an exam. So they were really differentiating within the class the different kinds of assignments that there are. And then multiple students talked about busy work and how frustrating they find busy work. I think there's a whole other question of how they define something as busy work, but they often felt that their classes were padded with assignments that weren't meaningful, and that was fair game for cheating. 20% did talk about the effect on others. In most instances, this was in the sense of if you're cheating and you get a degree and you're not skilled at that degree, like in nursing or in, medicine or as an airline pilot, that could hurt other people. And then a few, I think there were only three, talked about hurting others academically, that it wasn't fair for people to get this advantage when other people were not. And then about 20% or 19% said ultimately you're only hurting yourself. So these were people that, for the most part, obviously did not approve of, for the most part, of cheating or plagiarism or any kind of infringement on academic integrity. So if we kind of bring this all together, I mean, I think one thing is just, for the most part, that students do not seem to be construing academic dishonesty as a moral issue. They have a lot of rationalization. They have a lot of explanations for it, and the word kind of ethics or morality was not coming up in our inductive work. And I think Matt's work speaks to that idea that there aren't strong relationships, at least with the three moral domains that you looked at. Um, Overarchingly, students tend to rely on situational and contingent explanations. So it's focused on the type of class, the type of assignment, and circumstances, and less so on that rational self-interest. So I think, although qualitative studies doesn't have predictions, I think I was expecting more students to talk about the fact that they really needed to do well in order to succeed. And you really didn't see that. It really was based much more on these kind of situational circumstances. And that's how they seem to make sense of it the most. Um, Also, students, for the most part, focused on the cheater, for lack of a better word. Um, they did not focus on how it might affect the peers, those who they are stealing from, and the faculty. So it was definitely a very kind of, you know, centered on the self. So I wanted to, before we kind of have our final thoughts and open it up to questions, I think that this is a really important point, and this was shared by one of the participants. And she says, I think we also need to ask the question of what qualifies as academic cheating in our current world. I have had professors who encourage us to use AI to help us understand difficult readings or material to help us format work. On the other hand, I've also had professors with policies regarding automatic failure if there is the use of AI detected. I think the concept of cheating needs to be reevaluated due to the mass amount of changes there have been in technology and education over the years. And I think we at SUNY New Paltz and universities and colleges across the world are trying to do that. We're all trying to find our way. But I think it is really affecting students because they don't know what to do with these tools, and how to think about it, because there are such various responses to from professors. So, I mean, what are the solutions? I mean, obviously, I mean, a couple of things that I was thinking, I mean, would be great if we could ameliorate stress for students. I think there are some things that we could do in the classroom. I mean, we could have more assignments over time rather than the high stakes assignments, parts of a paper rather than a final paper. But again, I think to me, a lot of students talked about this idea of non-valued assignments. And so I think, I don't know. So ensuring that students understand the rationale and importance of specific assignments, I think if we can try to convey that, that would be helpful. And then obviously clarifying expectations and problems. I also think, Matt, I was wondering, I mean, given your finding about community, I wonder if increasing the sense of community within the class
Yeah,
would would
yeah,
be,
yeah.
another way. Like, is that something that would lend itself to students feeling less inclined to cheat? I suppose it would depend on the culture of the class, right? So if the group itself was condoning cheating, then it would be, yeah.
Yeah, or promoting just connection to the, just the university as a whole, right? That membership of like,
Right.
you're promoting this value even beyond the classroom, but just, the university culture as a whole. So
Exactly, exactly. Um, yeah, so that's what we've been grappling with. I see some, well, I can't really do the questions. So are we gonna try to do some questions now, Carl?
Yeah,
Or
yeah. Matt, maybe if you stop sharing, then people can see each other. If that's the end of your slides officially. Yes. Okay, great.
oh wait, oh sorry, I just did we had a thank you slide for the for the students who worked on it. So
Oh,
just wanted to give a shout out to them as well. So yeah,
sorry,
but you
cut
can go
that
ahead
off.
to the discussions. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so we've got one question from our colleague Sai that we could get to. I can read that out. This is a great time for people to, you can either post questions in the chat, or if you want to put your hand up, then we can call on you and you can unmute yourself, which is sometimes easier. Sorry, I'm just moving things around on my screen so I can see everything. While we're waiting for maybe some questions to come in, I'll just put out one of my questions for discussion, and would love to hear, your perspectives, Tabitha and Matt, but also from others in the group, because I'm sure we're not the only ones grappling with this, obviously. But like I've been finding in our psychology department, a lot of the discussion about students' use, academic integrity in general, but particularly the AI stuff, is just really adversarial in tone. There seems to be this kind of like us versus them in many cases, where it's like faculty perceive that students are using AI to get away with something, and we're trying to convince, or we're trying to prevent them from doing that because we want them to learn what we want them to learn, which clearly is not always in sync with what they want to be learning. So this is kind of a big question. Again, would love to hear other people's thoughts on this, but do you have any thoughts about how instructors can engage more effectively? This is, Tabitha, partly what you were just talking about, but find some kind of like middle ground where people are in agreement about what it actually is important for them to be learning these days, and then working backwards from that to what are the appropriate tools to do that. Huge question, I'm aware. Sorry.
I don't- um, maybe we can see if someone else has some thoughts on that.
Anyone want to throw a lifeline out for our presenters? Let's see. I can't see everybody, but I think if people put a hand up, or just, is this something that others are experiencing in their classrooms, on their campuses? Anyway, Carolyn, president of SSEA. Thank you. Oh, that's a thumbs up. Do you want to comment, Carolyn? Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
oh,
yeah,
please,
I'll just say that it depends upon which part of our campus is focused on it, right? So AI is students trying to cheat is very much kind of more mindful in our more writing intensive departments. Think in kind of humanities, for instance. Folks in business, our health schools, our kind of more social science and departments tend to be a lot more invested in trying to figure out how to use it, incorporate it in class, and use a tool. Some of our humanities, our folks are doing actually having an AI um, conference that's international on our campus in April, and kind of the breadth of those opinions are very much kind of represented in what's going to be presented. So I appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. Anyone else have thoughts on that? Or then we can go to Sai's question. Oh, Kathleen Rogers, please.
I really appreciate this. I'm taking a certificate program right now on um, being better at teaching online. And one of the major components of it is to come up with, what are we trying to teach our students, and narrowing down what the assignments are. Um, and what's most important in those assignments, and really, coming up with rubrics to go along with them, and really making the students feel like there is a purpose for these, as well as making sure that those assignments go along with what they're going to be doing. I'm a special ed teacher, so as special ed teachers, so this is great.
Thank you. Perry Levis.
Hi, I'm an assistant professor in the political science department at Rhode Island College, which is a state college. And I'm wondering, Tabitha, I came a little bit late, because I was in office hours, but I'm wondering if you sliced your data by race and ethnicity and by income and how that may look different.
Mm.
Because what I'm hearing from my students, and I primarily first gen college, which was an HSI before we eliminated the program. So we have a large amount of immigrant students and low income marginalized populations. And most of my students work at least part time or many full time while they're in school and have significant familial responsibilities. And I'm seeing them using AI just as a tool for efficiency. Like it's a time saver. And it's not necessarily that they want to be cheating. And so I'm wondering if you and Matthew did any analysis of the data by race and ethnicity and or income or any other SCS indicators.
Mm.
And I apologize if I missed that in the
Yeah.
presentation.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely did not with the qualitative. They're just simply, first of all, it's hard to do that with qualitative, because you're not looking, you can't do comparisons, systematically. But I think it's a really important point. And I think, I mean, it's interesting that efficiency didn't come up, but it has certainly for me in my informal conversations with students. And we have a very similar population at SUNY New Paltz, a lot of students working. Um, but I guess my question would be, what is efficiency looking like then? So how are they using it? Um, yeah, I mean, it's definitely I could imagine that being a very clear goal for them, that it's more efficient to use this. But I wonder what that looks like. But I agree with you. Students are, a lot of them are saying it's, the timepiece. They just don't have the time.
Yeah. I think we could ask them what it looks like. I think that we make a lot of assumptions about how they're using AI, but I
Hmm.
don't think in the last 3 years as it's come on board, we haven't really done a lot of good data analysis and data collection about how they're actually using it. We're just talking about how they should or should not be using it. So I think
Right.
that's also the point. But thank you both.
Yeah, I do want to say one thing, and I forgot we didn't actually put this slide up. One of the things that we've also become interested in is not to get too off track, but students are integrating AI into all avenues of their life, including interpersonal relationships. And I think there's some really interesting questions. So they're using AI, for example, to figure out how to keep somebody interested in a new relationship. They're literally putting, and this is anecdotal, but this is students have talked to me about, if they're dating somebody and they want to keep that person interested, they'll go to AI and they'll say, what is the best way to convey interest, in a text? Um, and I think it's a really interesting question of how they might perceive that use of AI in a different way than academically. Um, and how those pair up. Like again, I think I don't know, it's becoming so much a part of daily life now, that I think there's some really provocative questions about that. So that was a little off tangent, a little tangent there, but I wanted to make sure that I threw that out there.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the question, Perry. Mauriane, I'll get to you in a second. Just wanted to highlight a couple of comments people have posted in the chat first, so I don't lose track of them. One from our colleague at SUNY New Paltz, Cyrus Mulready. So really interested in the contrast between the quantitative result that students with a communal perspective are somewhat less likely to cheat, while some students in the qualitative study don't seem to see their behaviors as harmful to the community. Is this a point of communication we can have with our students, telling them about the ways in which the behavior harms our educational environments? I think that goes back to kind of that same point. What are we assigning them and why? And do we need to kind of overhaul, both kind of community in the classroom and then just what are the rational expectations from them now? And similarly, Rachel Riglino, also of SUNY New Paltz, says, I should not say this aloud, but I wonder how this ties into the general education requirements in general. Many of them see these courses as obstacles to the courses they really want to take. So because we are a liberal arts college, we do require students to take, a bunch of courses across disciplines to expose them to the full liberal arts education, but some of them don't care about that. And so I think that's another kind of structural issue to be thinking about for sure. I don't know if you guys want to comment on that, or then we'll get to Moriana's question.
I
To
mean,
Go
bubble
ahead.
up.
Oh, go ahead, Tabitha. Go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, speaking to Sarah's earlier question, yeah, I think it's absolutely true that I think students, at New Paltz have a strong sense of community, but it's a matter of making that connection to this particular issue. And I think that we can definitely be more intentional about that. And I think that's a really good point. So I just wanted to speak to that. I don't know if you had an additional comment, Tabitha.
I was just going to say the GE thing. I mean, I think that students have a lot of hostility towards GE, actually. They feel that it's a waste of their time. Not all students. I mean, I'm obviously generalizing here, but I think that there was in the conversation again, anecdotally, I had with my students that spurned this study. That was a really strong thing they talked about. That they just felt that they categorized GE classes as completely different than classes that are for their major. And they think about them differently. They think about cheating related to those classes differently. Um, yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. All right, Moriana Garcia, thank you for your patience.
Hello, I'm a scholarly communication librarian at the University of Rochester. And as part of my job, I support open scholarship, open access publishing. And I think we see a lot of confusion between the legal framework of intellectual property and licenses for open educational resources where you can reuse the content, you can create derivatives from that content, and plagiarism. So there are two separate things, but people tend to put them together. So the ideas cannot be copyrighted. You can only copyright the expression of those ideas. So that interplay between what is a legal framework and a cultural or local policy framework, and how to help students understand. I don't know if you can talk a little bit about that. And of course, when you add AI, no copyrightable, it becomes even more confusing for them.
I don't know that I can speak to that because I have confusion myself. So I think that's the problem, right? I think that we don't exactly sometimes know how to talk to students about these issues. So I don't know that I have much to add to that, but Matt, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, I think just sometimes we've had success when we kind of loop in just kind of that, people kind of discussing kind of sources, like when we're talking about, in our grad level classes and we're talking about, how do you develop your thesis, just kind of like presenting people with like, these different more specific discussions about different types of work and copyrights and plagiarism. So just having more kind of like high level discussions about what plagiarism is, like, those plagiarism, quizzes that we give, we started giving some of us in the department, right? And students get really surprised about that. So just kind of like, I think some of those are really, some of those resources that explain that are pretty high level, speaking to Moriana's point about making those distinctions. So I think, yeah, just kind of incorporating like higher level, like more detailed kind of explanations of these issues, because as you note, they're tricky, right? So yeah.
And I actually go back, I kind of take one step removed. I mean, I talk a lot about the epistemological ways of knowing, kind of the very different ways of knowing. I integrate that into my classes to try to get students thinking about um, these different sources in different ways, whether it be personal opinion, whether it be different types of, like you said, to your point, something that's copyrighted, something that isn't. Um, and so that becomes part of the conversation as well.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question from the chat from Leah Manning. So, hi, developmental psychologist two here, also a co-chair of the Academic Integrity Committee, so lots of crossover interest. Relating back to the change in behaviors and attitudes from high school to college and my own observations about students' maturity, do you all think the increase in cheating may also be related to a sort of sustained adolescent perspective into college? Interesting, very developmental focus on this. And again, if others in the audience have experienced this, and I always keep, this is still the COVID generation, right? How much did their experiences in middle school and high school shape their attitudes towards what is fair and appropriate?
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, that kind of carryover from that kind of perspective, right? You've experienced the ease, maybe you've benefited from it in some kind of way. So, yeah, I mean, I think that idea that some of that would carry over into this kind of extended kind of perspective, adolescent perspective, makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if other people want to jump in as well, but.
I see Alexander Eustace Corin has a hand up. If you want to, I don't know if you're responding to this or another question, but either's fine.
Hi. Yeah, I'm a doctoral student also at the University of Rochester, specializing in moral development during emerging adulthood. And I just had a couple questions. One was I first I was kind of curious if there were any differences between the male and female participants in how they responded, because anecdotally it seems to me that it's the male students who are sometimes a little bit more checked out of like consideration, like moral considerations. Although I did notice that the distribution wasn't really 50-50. It was like 60-16. So did you uncover anything interesting there?
It's
Go ahead, Tabitha.
were you speaking about the qualitative?
Yes.
Yeah, it's so hard to do qualitative, to look at those individual difference variables when you're doing qualitative because, I mean, basically you can do a chi-square, but other than that, there's not a lot of ways to look at that systematically. So I really didn't do a lot of that. I mean, I think that that's a fair question, and I think that we could do a better job looking at a more mixed method, a larger sample moving forward and looking at those differences. Matt, did you have any differences in yours?
I was just saying, no, we didn't observe any differences, but it was also skewed very heavily female. So that speaks to the issue of larger data, more balanced to kind of explore that in greater detail. But it's a really good point.
Okay, thank you. So we are pretty much out of time. There are some interesting comments coming up in the chat, so I encourage people to take a quick look at those. Hopefully, Daisy, we can leave this open for a couple of minutes. But yeah, other people reporting lasting effects of COVID, more cheating, all of these phenomena that are making it very challenging to be an educator these days. Still rewarding, but it's complicated for sure. So I want to really thank our presenters. So Dr. Tabitha Holmes, Dr. Matthew Weiss of SUNY New Paltz. I know this is a topic, obviously, that really is significant for a lot of people. So great to see some attempts at fully understanding it from the students' perspectives, as well as how we're interacting with them. So I will just give a brief plug for our next webinar, which is also going to be focused on college, but a kind of different question. So that's going to be in collaboration with the Society for Research on Adolescence, SRA, and it's going to focus on, it's going to be a panel discussion with several presenters looking at, is college still worth it? Exploring alternative paths into emerging adulthood. So we're going to have a number of perspectives on just how students are making that determination, partly given how the job environment has changed due to AI and, less faith that taking out student loans is going to be worth it for some people. So we're pinning down a date for that, but it should be in late April. So we'll certainly get out announcements about that as soon as we possibly can. And then I also hope many of you are going to be joining us for the SSEA thematic conference in Poznan, Poland this summer. That's going to be June 29th to July 1st on emerging adults on the road to maturity. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tabitha and Matt. Thank you, Daisy, for handling all the tech side of things. And yeah, we hope this was interesting and compelling. I don't know that we got like answers out of it, but clearly everyone's grappling with this. So thanks a lot for sharing your research on this and to everyone for making the time for this. And
Everyone.
Thank you.